Fanny Jones. Cofiant Mrs. Fanny Jones. Gweddw y Diweddar Barch J. Jones Talysarn by O. Owain of Talysarn. As Welsh people, we are under a great debt to this woman, and we can never put a price on her service, nor measure the work she did in being an instrument to give the people's preacher to the people. In her self-denial, Wales heard a message from heaven. Her efforts facilitated the way for Wales to be drenched by the irresistible eloquence of the hero from Talysarn. Biographies of women are not common in Wales, however much many deserve it. Undoubtedly, that is a loss to the country. It is a priceless service to commemorate those who are worthy. Although I have had some information here and there, it is to my mother that I am indebted for her story in its wide extent, since she was born and bred in this area, therefore had knowledge of Mrs. Jones's movements and her private life. From my mother's reminiscences, I could have written a volume about her, twice the size, and if any letter of praise comes from the work, she has the first claim to it. Birth and early years. Frances Edwards, or rather as she was more commonly known, Fanny Edwards, was a daughter of Thomas and Anne Edwards. She was born at Cefnfaes, Festiniog, in May 1805. From Cefnfaes, the family moved to Llanllyfni, to Llwyd Coed farm. They moved from there to a farm called Talysarn. Thomas Edwards was looked upon as a cultured man, of a cultivated mind who was very knowledgeable with regard to slate quarries. He was among the first in Dyffryn Nantlle to hold the office of overseer. He was a very zealous Methodist, taking a great interest in the cause in Talysarn. Fanny's mother, Anne Edwards, is portrayed as a woman of strong common sense and of strong religious convictions. She possessed an exceptional and melodious singing voice, and since it was so penetrating, it could be heard throughout the whole chapel. Anne Edwards died in March 1816, at the early age of 35 years, and Fanny Jones loved to speak often of her mother, and the longing, hiraethus memories were intensely felt. She admired her mother's piety, and remembered the sad moments when she died, so peacefully and without struggle, calling her children together to kiss them and exhort them to godly living. By this time we see young Fanny bereft of her mother at the time of her awakening, that time which is so full of life and vivacity, a restless time common in young people. Here she was in this situation without home guidance, at the most important time of her life, the period of awakening to self-knowledge. The young girl is face to face with the world, and the world is dangerous for her, having lost the one who would have guided her. But we shall see the effect this had on the life of Fanny Edwards. When she came to a suitable age, she was sent to school at Carnarvon, and during this time her circle of acquaintance widened. She tended to be friendly and affectionate. Naturally, therefore, she was a character who drew people to her. She had a good education in Carnarvon, and since she learned quickly, she benefited greatly, more possibly than others who didn't have such a keen mind. While on this course of instruction, she came into contact with several important people in society, and the association with some lasted to the end of her life. One of her best friends was Miss Roberts, Castell, Bangor, and she frequently went to her home to spend the Sabbath with her. Miss Roberts married Mr. Owain Roberts, Dinas, near Carnarvon, but their friendship did not cease while they lived. In addition to her school, she had another important advantage. through the woman with whom she lodged, Susie Roberts. She was industrious, noted for her cleanliness, orderliness, and economical ways, and was very wise and provident. She taught Fanny Jones how to behave properly and modestly, and she responded to the instruction. Since she was naturally ladylike, and, as was noticed earlier, quick to learn, she soon became quite polished and an adornment to the circle she served. After returning from school, she was given the total care of her father's home, and she played her part to great satisfaction. She showed providence in her care of her father's possessions and circumstances at this time of his life. Thrift was instinctive in her character. It was not for show. This element or feature remained prominent all her life. Providence and thrift were her chief characteristics, but they did not develop into stinginess or miserliness. She controlled them to be beautiful and acceptable virtues in her character, since she showed so much compassion towards those in needy circumstances. She used them to her praise in her youth, in her family responsibilities, and in her old age. Her life was leavened with them to be of service, and widened her popularity. She was spoken of when she ran her father's home as one remarkably kind to the poor and compassionate to the needy. She believed that those who were merciful to the poor would not be in need while on earth, and her beliefs were revealed in this more than once. It so happened during her time at home that there was a year of scarcity, and necessity drove scores of the poor to go from house to house to beg, and each one took care to call at every farmhouse, since they thought it would be easier to get a bit of food there. Although crowds called at Taldroost, Fanny Edwards would not refuse to give alms to any of them. She knew that the God of providence above saw all her kindnesses, and that she, through these kind deeds, was working according to the commandments. She had a religious upbringing, and without realizing it, her love for her Saviour grew intensely, and that love was rooted through every part of her life until it flowered in beauty and fragrance. She used to say that she did not know of any time in her life that she did not love Jesus Christ. In addition to the religious home she had, her religious leanings were nurtured from within. She possessed circumstances which gave every advantage to show the love that was in her heart and to warm the flame which was burning and growing gradually. She appreciated these advantages and said towards the end of her life that these very circumstances were of enormous advantage in her increasing devotion. One of the people who were a help to Fanny Edwards in nourishing this reverence for religious things was Anne Parry, Tea Capel, Llanllyfni. She was an especially godly old woman. Her godliness made her well known and famous among the ministers of Wales. This elderly sister kept the chapel house at Llanllyfni for 50 years, and there are many interesting stories about her. She prayed much, and there are facts to prove that some ministers had powerful meetings at the very moments when she prayed for them, that God would own their message. In the old days, preachers would travel on horseback, and everyone who passed through Llanllyfni would be sure to call on Anne Parry for some refreshments. Many men of reputation and influence would come to Llanllyfni to preach at this time, and everyone knew it was the old lady who succeeded in getting them, since she used to keep a journal. This was the environment which influenced Fanny Edwards, and it was under the mantle of this old sister that she was brought up, and who gave her guidance. Fanny herself promised that she had listened to her advice and that it would be a help to her all her life. other circumstances which left their mark on her whole life were the presence and victory of the old godly people in the religious meetings, and the words of Fanny Jones towards the end of her life were, "I would never tire of the godly old people jumping up and rejoicing in Llanllefni when they were on fire praising God, and the influence that was in their lives at that time has stayed with me all my life." She was drawn like that to strong spiritual characters, Welsh characters, old-fashioned, sincere, until she increased in the virtues they had. Courtship and marriage. After John Jones's arrival in TALSARN, he established singing meetings. Among the young people who gathered like this was a bright young girl, lively and pretty, therefore special, a young girl who drew everyone's attention with her beauty and cheerfulness. This girl drew the attention of John Jones, and his love began to stir when he saw her. And if heaven leads in life or provides in marriage, these circumstances worked for this. A secret inner turbulence came to the bosom of Fanny Edwards. She couldn't describe it. She didn't know what it was. She hadn't spoken to the young stranger, and yet there was something wonderful and mysterious between them, something she could neither describe nor explain. At the same time there was a stirring in the heart of the young man. Though he looked calm and unmoved, so unperturbed that no one knew from him outwardly that he had noticed anyone more than anyone else in the singing meetings. Yet something spoke inside him, and his thoughts always ran to the bright and beautiful one at the singing meeting. Who could explain the mystery? Neither knew what the other was thinking. They didn't have an opportunity to make known the fervency of their hearts to each other. They didn't converse in such a way as to convey their thoughts and wishes to each other. What therefore caused these stirrings in the hearts of each, one for the other? We have to conclude that heaven was intervening to lead them to each other, and the value that one was to the other in their lives confirms this idea. It was the choice of God to care for one of the strong of Wales and to prepare him for the service of his country. And as Johann Eivion said with great vivacity in a cywydd, an alliterative poem, about the subject, John Jones oedd long lawn o ddoniau'r nefoedd uniawn, Fanny dda a lliwiau'n llon, hwylus rhag craig gofalon, Duw o'i rhodd, gododd o gant ar gyfer y gŵr gwiwfant. John Jones was a ship full of heaven's upright gifts. Good Fanny, merely steering, sailing along in spite of rocks of care. God gave her, raised her up out of 100 for the sake of the worthy man. More than once, John Jones himself found his eyes drawn toward the young girl without knowing it. Fanny Edwards from the other side was fixing her eyes on him in amazement. In this unwitting meeting of eyes, each one awoke as from a dream, and in a twinkling turned their eyes in another direction. This eye contact happened often, and it is odd that both fell into the same mistake as the other without ever saying a word to each other. Yet something spoke in each heart that there was some strange meeting together of the two hearts. Fanny had stolen John Jones's heart, and John Jones had stolen Fanny's heart. These strange feelings increased in the heart of John Jones, and the spark began to be a burning flame, burning so much that he himself took note of the young girl one night in the chapel house, and the fact that John Jones, quiet, deep, and serious, noticed her, gave him strong proof that she had totally won his heart. he asked the family who kept T. Capel, the chapel house, who was that young girl? Oh, they said, Fanny Edwards, daughter of Thomas Edwards Taldrost, a respected farmer and overseer in Cloddvar Lawn quarry. Well, he replied, she's a very lively girl. That was all he said that night. Somehow he had felt inadequate in her company during the conversation at T. Capel, and he noticed her again at his lodging, that is, in the home of his cousin, the wife of Mr. Griffith Williams, overseer of the Talysarn quarry, and Mr. Williams understood at once that Fanny had won his heart. He said, "She'll make you a good wife, John Jones," appealing to a stranger who was in the house who knew Fanny well for a confirmation of his observation. He confirmed it with the sentence, "She'll make a very excellent one for him." After this conversation, the matter was left alone, and they continued with other ordinary things. But, as Emerson said, all mankind loves a lover. So it was with John Jones, and he went to the stranger who was at his lodgings the following day, revealing to him the tumult in his bosom, how the girl had won his heart. At the end of the second singing meeting, John Jones went to Fanny Edwards with the purpose of escorting her a little way in the direction of her home, and before leaving put a letter into her hand. Fanny Edwards went home and, going straight away to her bedroom, opened the letter, asked for guidance from heaven in the circumstances, and placed herself in the Lord's hands. John Jones went there for her answer at midday the next day, and although Fanny Edwards was certain of her own feelings, she couldn't give an answer until she had spoken with her father. So he had to come away a little stunned. In the meantime, he went to see Dr. Griffith Roberts, bone doctor, Llanllywni, the stranger, and asked him to say a word on his behalf to Thomas Edwards, and also to ask Fanny Edwards for a definite answer to his letter. Not knowing what her feelings were, the obliging man went, quite anxiously, because he did not in the least understand how she felt, and conveyed to her the request of John Jones. And in spite of her great surprise, Fanny was totally ready and ripe for the question, answering in the affirmative without hesitation. In this reply, the two felt that they had had in the agreement a basis for the comfort of their lives. In the story of the two, we see an intellectual mystery coming to light, the association of minds or the influence of thoughts on each other. Each one worked unknowingly on the thoughts of the other. Fanny Edwards thought about John Jones, whether in her sight or out of her sight, before ever speaking a word to him, and John Jones thought about Fanny Edwards before he ever spoke a word to her. Indeed, we could say that there was some leading from above in guiding them towards one another, touching their thoughts, until it produced feelings that inclined them towards each other. It was said, indeed Fanny Jones herself told the story, an amazing little tale about her, before she ever saw John Jones. Her father and stepmother were in Charenton at the time of the 1822 session of the Calvinistic Methodists, and after coming home they told of a strange man of a preacher, a modest young man who was having tea at the same time as them, and they described him as one full of virtues, and the most pleasant that they had ever had in their company. As she heard this story told, something struck Fanny's mind, although she hadn't seen him, that he would be her husband. From that moment she couldn't get rid of the idea. It followed her everywhere. Soon after this, Fanny Edwards heard of the young man's coming to Llanllywni to preach, and she made a decision to go to hear him and see him. Unfortunately, she failed to fulfill her household duties in time to go to the chapel punctually, and she had to be satisfied to hear a little of him from the door. Although she didn't see the preacher, there was something in his voice that touched her heartstrings a little, and for the life of her she couldn't stop thinking that he would be her husband. We see through this that Providence was working in the background and working for her good in preparing the two hearts for each other. From the viewpoint of heaven, Fanny Edwards was the perfect helpmeet, the most suitable from all aspects to help John Jones to prepare himself to be God's messenger and to deliver with irresistible strength the great message entrusted to him from heaven. In the meantime, before John Jones's messenger came to Fanny, any word or glance, every movement of his would have a deep impression on Fanny and caused a turbulence in her heart. It was not surprising then, when the message came from him, that she received it with a ready acceptance. Some sweet power had made her tender to the situation, some power or influence she couldn't explain. Having consented to the proposal in this way, they spoke in a friendly way for a while, and having the consent of her father, they agreed to marry, and the agreement was sealed in an afternoon in April, between 4 and 5 o'clock. The custom at that time was very different from the situation today. After completing the agreement mentioned, John Jones went, exactly as the custom was then, to the fellowship to announce his purpose, even though the girl he loved was present, and asked for the prayers of their fellow Christians for them. He believed that the situation was too important to embark on without divine strength and guidance, and he implored them earnestly, as members of the Church of God, to take their cause often to the throne of God. The Saturday following this announcement in the Sayat, John Jones went to Carnarvon to buy a license, but to his great shock he couldn't get it, since his intended wife was too young. She hadn't yet reached her 18th birthday. He was thrown into a bit of a quandary, as he was en route to Ynys-Môn, Anglesey. But he suddenly thought of a plan to get himself out of the difficulty, and that was to write a note to the parish clerk to announce the banns the following Sunday, and he persuaded a friend from Llanllefni to take the note to the clerk. The banns were announced the following Sunday, and that unknown to Fanny Edwards. She came to know of it through some friends who happened to be in church at the time. According to the parish register, they were married on Wednesday, the 14th of May, 1823, not in 1824, as it seems that some have said. The clerk noticed that there was sincerity and honesty to be seen in the wedding arrangements. Everything was done openly, with nothing stealthy in the preparations. Wife and mother. Now we see Fanny Jones starting on the most important part of her life, a period when she had to put into it much wisdom, foresight, diligence, effort, and thrift. And her life, her connections, etc., asked for an abundant degree of the features named. She wasn't yet fully 18, but she undertook the responsibility, and the success of her life depended on her strength with the help of the virtues noted. She understood her husband's position and also her obligations in the circumstances. She believed, like one of the English authors, that true love is having self-sacrifice for another object. Theodore Watts Dunton. She must have pondered greatly on the cost before coming to the decision, since it was such an important step, and that she had a great part in making John Jones the preacher of the people in Wales. She drew on all her resources, to put her understanding into action. One of the first things she felt was that John Jones wouldn't have peace and quiet to study and compose while continuing to work in the quarry, and she resolved to get him from there quickly. She proceeded, after marrying, to build a shop in Talysarn, in a place convenient to the quarry. Some at that time said that the owner of the quarry built the shop for them, while others said it was her father who did it. But whoever is correct, it doesn't make much difference which. The work was done. Her life began with great responsibility. We connect Fanny Jones with these revolutionary things, since she was the direct cause of them. The responsibility of building a house and a shop. She built them near to the Talysarn quarries and by the chapel. For a year after the wedding, John Jones still went to the quarry, and he preached on work nights and on the Sabbaths, and his wife didn't complain at being alone, but took care to let him spend his time reading and studying. Having begun their lives together, Fanny Jones persuaded her husband to give up his work at the quarry, not only because of the dangers, but so that he would be enabled to spend all his time preparing for the ministry, in seeking to save sinners. She succeeded in getting him out of the quarry and committing all his time to the ministry, and this was a cause of rejoicing for her throughout all her life. She had been an instrument for her husband to consecrate his whole life to the cause of his Saviour. By her endeavour with the shop, and it was a very great effort, she succeeded in supporting John Jones and the family, and she gave him every opportunity to prepare for his great mission. She took all the responsibility for the business, so that John Jones didn't have to worry or bother at all with the work. Fanny Jones possessed plenty of willpower in undertaking the task, and also plenty of ability for it to work out successfully. She feared in case earthly circumstances should have an effect on John Jones's spirituality, since she was totally convinced that he was specially set apart for the work. As Welsh people, we are under a great debt to this woman, and we can never put a price on her service, nor measure the work she did in being an instrument to give the people's preacher to the people. In her self-denial, Wales heard a message from heaven. Her efforts facilitated the way for Wales to be drenched by the irresistible eloquence of the hero from Talysarn. Her endeavour was a means for John Jones to have leisure to produce his great thoughts. Her efforts allowed him to travel throughout Wales to declare the message with such strength. He acknowledged this often while on his journeys, and he spoke of how much of a comfort Fanny was to him, and how she was such a blessing to him in his inner being. Fanny, he said, is a great help to me in going on through the journey of my life. He was altogether wholly to thank his wife for this quietness from earthly care. She accepted the pains and burdens of life so that he could enjoy the quietness of the mountain of the Lord, and to draw from the divine thoughts. His soul drank from the great inexhaustible fountain, which is everlasting in its springing and its continuing. O glorious wife! Although John Jones became very popular, his earnings were very small, and although his labour was endless, and his calls were frequent and many, he was not much nearer the shore in a financial sense, since his income was shamefully weak. Since they had increasing family pressures, it was necessary for Fanny to double her efforts, and she did that rather than hinder nor at all prevent her husband going on. She thought highly of him, and that his success in his service to his country and the Lord depended much on her effort. Also, she possessed very high views of the talent of her husband. She believed that he was a special gift from above, and that her responsibility was to ease the way so that his talent had every facility to be revealed. She admired his honesty and conscientiousness, and his pure and unsullied character, and since her belief in her husband was so deep, she gave him her sympathy in the hardships of life, and she assisted him in chasing away every weariness by reminding him of parts of the Scriptures, most commonly the Psalms. Her exceptional acumen and keenness of mind, and here was one of the strongest features of her character, was an advantage to her, in view of her unselfish nature, and were the basis of her right and pure purposes. If it had happened that her husband had failed on the national stage, he would have gone against the wishes and assistance of his faithful wife, one who rejoiced in his success, one who had confidence concerning his future, one who did everything possible for him toward his lifting of fallen humanity and of gathering the lost sheep of Christ. If it hadn't been for the effort of Fanny Jones, doubtless John Jones would have failed, since he would have never provided for his family with the small earnings he had from preaching, and Wales would have lost the most important message in the world. They had 12 children, and his earnings were too little to be able to keep the family, but for the industry and thrift of Fanny Jones. If it had happened that she had been different from what she was, wasteful, thoughtless, and lazy, John Jones would have had to set apart his time for temporal needs, but she was otherwise, and Wales should, not only Dyffryn Nantlle, raise her up as a woman worthy to be remembered. Had it not been for the valuable virtues of her character, John Jones would have had to give his genius to work for earthly things, and through that Wales would have lost a vital message and couldn't have raised his fellow men nor given them spiritual edification. O noble, splendid work! A woman who was spiritual enough to hear the message entrusted to her and had plenty of grace, wisdom, and love in her heart to carry it out for the benefit of her country and the pleasure of her Creator. However busy and hurried were her business troubles and her earthly demands, they did not affect at all her faithfulness and punctuality at the means of grace. She closed up her shop on work nights, that is, for the Sayat or fellowship meeting and the prayer meeting, and took care that all the children came to all the services without exception. Fanny Jones came there in her black, the children being driven like an army in front of her to the seat, so that they didn't stop and loiter in front of the chapel. When John Jones was at home, all the children had to get up early to do their chores, and in the evening again they were expected to be ready with a Bible verse each, and the mother wouldn't be slow with her verse. She took that as a habit for herself, since she believed that to be an example like this had great influence. Businesswoman. Soon the scope of her business widened, so that she had to keep servants and maids, and her chief mark at this time was to take care to keep them all busy. She was privileged with the talent of winning customers, and also with skill and peerless wisdom to keep them after getting them, and they remained faithful customers to her while she was in business. They kept a blacksmith's forge to be convenient to all rural needs in the area, and they hired a craftsman for this service. Thus they succeeded to have some comfort, and this help, along with other things, was enough to enable them to live more easily. Also, they kept all sorts of materials and tools for the workmen, together with gunpowder for use in the quarries. Bit by bit the shop developed, and that under Fanny Jones's management alone, until her circle widened. In the end, the business became a general drapery, grocery, ironmongery, etc., on a rather abundant scale. Since she kept a shop with such a variety of articles, and the population was growing as the quarries were developing, the calls for different goods in the business were great. To meet the hosts of requests and to make up the usual supply, she would go all the way to Chester and to different towns in England. Sometimes she travelled by coach part of the way, other times she would ride the whole way to Chester on horseback, and this meant, at that inconvenient period, undoubted determination and courage. Look at the picture. A woman who had denied herself the temporal luxuries of life, who had undertaken its burdens, its pains, its troubles, had gone out to the field as if to wrestle with circumstances in the heat of her love for her husband, and with the help of heaven had succeeded in overcoming her difficulties, and had withstood their assaults. Her love for the success of her husband was the means for her to tread on the rocky objections of the world, and to fly from them higher to the cloudless blue sky of success. Who would not say, as they looked at this picture, "O excellent woman, splendid wife"? The blessing of her life was to strive for her husband's sake. She sucked comfort from the stuff that was a grief for some. She rejoiced in cares that would make some people complain. Her character strengthened and developed in circumstances which would weaken and ruin some wives. Because of the growth of her business, the development of the region, and the inconvenience of the shop in the face of this increase, they built a new house and shop in a central place in the Talysarn area, and they moved there. And doubtless this move was better for the shop, no matter how widespread was the sphere of her business in the old place. While in the new place she was very kind to the poor and tender to those in distress. She aimed hard to better the circumstances of the area, and one of the prominent marks of her life was to want to guide the poor in how to live and how to encourage them to economize. These were her works and her words, in accord with each other. She acted out what she preached, or more rightly, perhaps, she preached in her actions. Although she was thrifty and economical, and attempted to prepare for the future, she could not, because of the element of tenderness in her nature, leave anyone in want, and she contributed tens of pounds through this. She offered work to the poor children in the area, and gave them bellyfuls of food for doing it. She didn't believe in giving pennies to children, in case they got used to being wasteful in their childhood. Though she was stubborn and tough with regard to circumstances in the world, she wasn't allowed to avoid drinking from the bitter cup of the trials of the world, and the severity of the storms had this effect on her. The whirlwinds blasted a little the edge of her joy. She lost 3 children, and in August 1857 lost her husband, who was so dear in her eyes, and the one for whose sake she had devoted her life. She remained faithful to him, and was kind to him in the last moments. The death of John Jones affected her deeply. She was in the depth of the valley of sorrow, depressed and gloomy for a long time after he died. A remarkable fact in her history was that she was far above anyone in comforting those in mourning. She could give a word of comfort to those who were deepest in the moist land of tears, but when she herself was in the valley, it was difficult to meet anyone more grave. In her deep trial at this time, she received scores of letters to sympathize and comfort her. From among the multitude it is possible that one from the Morgans of Dyffryn is among the best. Dyffryn, August the 21st, 1857. Dear Mrs. Jones, I received a letter from your son containing the sad news of the death of your dear husband. I wasn't since some weeks daring to hope to hear anything else, yet when this heavy news came, the fact after all was incredible to me. Even now I cannot persuade myself that the world is without John Jones Talsarn. But oh, it is so. Oh, unrestorable loss. There are tens of thousands in Wales whose hearts are bleeding because of it, and not without cause. One of the chief pillars of Methodism has been broken. One who did more it cannot be argued against, nor is there anyone living now to draw the attention of the whole principality to the great things that belong to peace, one who was an instrument to stir more in the minds of thousands, who ended in eternal life. He turned many to righteousness. But the race is over, the prize is won, the crown is worn, no more fear for eternity. The lost enemy is defeated, the palms in his hand, and a tune more sweet than he ever composed, although some of them have great charm for us, on his lips. Almost we can imagine hearing him say to those he has left behind, "Don't weep, sorrow is over, joy has come in its place." But to you he is a great loss. Wales has lost an incomparable preacher. I have lost a dear friend, but you have lost everything that everyone else has lost, and much more. I don't know what to say to you. I don't know what to say to you. It would be easier for me to weep with you than to say something to you. It was not a small privilege to have lived with such a seraphic man. But that makes the bitterness of the loss greater for you. Further, the world cannot be but a desert for you. But you are not without the knowledge that there is one who can speak to content your heart that is troubled in the wilderness. You are not without knowing that you need not die of thirst in the parched land you are in, because there is a fountain of living water nearby. But you must have one to lead to it. I can only desire this for you. No one but the good physician can put the wine and oil on the wounds. But he is one so able for that today, and the one so ready to do it, as when he did that for Mary and Martha. There is no small consolation in the verse you taught the children before their tongues spoke clearly. Jesus wept. Mrs. Morgan joins with me in sympathizing with you all from the heart, and in greeting you and the whole family in the kindest way. May the God of the orphans and the judge of the widows keep you from sinking and sorrow as those without hope. I am hindered by a misfortune that my animal suffered from coming to the funeral. It would have been very good if I had been able to come there, although that would have been nothing. It would have been all I could have done now for one of the most excellent men who was ever on the earth, and one of those for whom I had more respect than anyone I ever knew. I am, dear Mrs. Jones, yours sincerely, Edward Morgan. As it can be seen, it was a very suitable letter for one of Fanny's state of mind. Her life spoke of how dear John Jones was in her eyes, and how faithful she had been to him. Last days, after giving up her shop, Fanny was for many years in a private house, Brynavon, and she spent her time seeing her friends and the old saints of the area. Also she went from place to place visiting her children, who were married and spread about. In May 1877 she went to Llandynam to comfort her son, the Reverend D. Lloyd-Jones, M.A., who had newly lost his wife. When she had been there for about 3 months, she got an inflammation of the lungs, and after being in bed for a short while, she died at the fair age of 72 years, 20 years after her dear husband, that is 13th of August, 1877. While in Llandynam she was quite calm and cheerful, and yet one day she said she thought she had come there to die. It was as if she had received a private message from the spiritual world. Around 5 days before her death, as spiritual as ever, she related her experience to the Reverend Daniel Rowlands, M.A., Bangor. In the Sayat, or fellowship meeting that night, the Reverend gentleman came to her and said, "Well, Mrs. Jones-Bach, what is on your mind tonight?" "Oh," she said, lifting up her hand, "I am very glad, Mr. Rowlands, that I have such a God to trust in. The same God I have here as I had at home. A God whose faithfulness I can trust in every place. Blessed be his name forever, forever." And she told her daughter Fanny one day, "I came here, my girl, because I am anxious for you. Thomas told me you were poorly, and I was afraid for you to come home and leave your brother in his trouble and his 2 little children in the care of strangers. I will help you raise this dear little baby." On the last Sabbath of her life, she said to her daughter Fanny, "The time has come to an end." "What do you mean?" asked her daughter. "Don't you know that it is 20 years since your father died?" "Yes, the 20 years are up." It is appropriate to mention here the strange coincidence relating to the 20 years. When John Jones was approaching death, he called Fanny Jones to his bedside, and naturally she was greatly troubled, and seeing her, he said, "Don't break your heart, my girl. You will come to heaven to me." "Oh," she said, "what breaks my heart is the fear that I won't be able to spend eternity with you. I shan't mind if my Heavenly Father leaves me here behind for 20 years, as long as I can come to you after that, then, John Bach." "Oh, you will, he said. "Don't let the devil pain you, Fanny Bach." It is glorious to see God's saints sailing to their home from the wilderness of this world, turning their backs on the tears and sighs and facing endless blessedness, leaving a world of great afflictions and going to eternal paradise, ending mourning and beginning bliss. Our subject when leaving this world was like a noble vessel going into the heavenly haven from the stormy ocean of life, and the virtues flowered so beautifully in her life, like white banners on the vessel, waving quietly under the gentle touching breezes of the land, where the sky is always clear. Lle mae'r wybren fyth yn glir. When, as if on the doorstep of another world, she called her daughter Fanny and said to her, "What do you think of your mother's faith?" "Oh," she said, "it is a true faith." And Mrs. Fanny Jones added, "I had 3 rocks to rest on through the night." And raising up her right hand, she said, "Here they are, and I give unto them eternal life. And the other," she said, lifting up her left hand, "and they shall never be lost. And the third," she said while beating her hand on her heart, "none shall pluck them out of my hand. Blessed be God, O my dear Jesus." At this David entered, and she said to him again, "I was telling your sister that I had 3 rocks through the night." And then she began shouting, "Glory forever for the unshakable plan of salvation. What do you think of your mother's faith, David Bach?" "It is a splendid one," he said. At that time Mr. Davies Llandinam came in, and seeing him she raised her hand and said, "Yes, Mr. Davies, everyone in these circumstances are on the same level, aren't they? On equality, isn't it?" "They are, Mrs. Jones," he replied, "but you will soon be on higher ground than I." On going down the stairs, he said with tears running down his cheeks, "Pray for the Lord to take her to himself. She is too good for this world, yes, too perfect indeed. Let her go." Isn't it a glorious death to die with every certainty that the everlasting arms were under her, and her entrance abundant into the glory of her Lord? This is what the Reverend D. Lloyd-Jones, M.A., said of her death. "One night the door of my room was knocked, and I was told she was worse. I got up and went to the room, and going behind her, I lifted her up to a sitting position by putting my arms under her armpits, and while I was holding her up, she looked towards heaven, and her immortal spirit flew to the unseen world." By this time, her industrious and troubleless life was over, a life of faithfulness and incomparable comfort to her husband. Her spirit flew to the one who gave it, and she left the world with the great sun of righteousness shining on her soul. Histories are speckled with men of philosophy having been destroyed by petulant wives, like Titian, Carlyle, Dickens, Thackeray, etc. But here is one whose wife was every comfort to him, one who had been a blessing to him and not a curse, one who had helped and not hindered him. Fanny kept thoroughly pure to him, and she assisted him in all the circumstances of his life. She did not give 1 minute of hindrance to her husband, but aimed to facilitate every part of his life. After the weary work, a life full of effort in a troubled age, her spirit was taken away to float in love and peace. Nofio mewn cariad a hedd.